Scott, he's the Chief Operating Officer for Sonoma-Ceutical. Scott has a long history in the dietary supplements and foods industry. He's a microbiologist in training, so has a really good feel for the scientific method and how that can be applied to actually not only make discoveries, but then figure out how to apply them to make people healthier. And given his microbiology background, you'll probably hear him talk about either up here or in discussions, you'll hear him talk about gut health, and he's been leading the Sonoma-Ceuticals effort, and he's going to tell us exactly what this material is that we're working with and we're so excited about, and frankly is this first trifecta of what we believe new ingredients from natural products should look like. So Scott, please approach the podium.
Thanks, Harold. So as Harold said, I'm Chief Operating Officer, which means that if you're enjoying the symposium and this wonderful venue and everything, you can bring those compliments to me. If you have any complaints, you can talk to Fanny in the back there. Actually, Fanny is really the one who put this thing together for us, and my thanks to her. If it weren't for her corralling all of us, the scientists, the business people, everyone, all the different ideas and interests and everything we have, probably wouldn't have come together. So thanks, Fanny. We really appreciate that. Also, thank you to Doug Brown and his team back there in Mission Control for making this all possible on Zoom and everything else. So, I actually think that the interesting thing about what we're doing here with Chardonnay is just how much of a surprise so many of the things that we've discovered are. So, superfood, I think, is a term that's maybe a little overused. Nonetheless, I think it's really appropriate for what we're doing. But I think for everyone, when I tell them that Chardonnay is a superfood, they're either a little skeptical or they're a little surprised, right? You really don't think of it in that context. And speaking of surprises, just a little side note here. When I got to the hotel yesterday, this was the text that my wife sent me. So she said, "Don't freak out." Of course, I immediately replied with, "Okay." And then she replied with this picture, which is why I don't have a suit and tie on today. So, but I figure if it's good enough for Harold, right? It's good for me. I thought about going full Harold, but I didn't have my shorts with me, and I don't spend as much time on a bike, so my legs aren't nearly as defined as his. So, but I thought I'd start by telling you a little bit about just wine in general. I'm sure a lot of you already know much of this, but when I started looking into it, I had always thought that wine had been around for a few thousand years, but 8,000 years was a little bit of a surprise. So, and this is the earliest known winemaking from archaeological evidence. It's probably likely that it even goes back further than that. So humans have been cultivating and using wine grapes for at least 8,000 years, perhaps even more. It's one of the most ancient foods we have, as a matter of fact. And today, there are more than 10,000 varieties of grapes. About 300 of those are used and commonly made into wine. But the amount of diversity that you find in this fruit, in this crop, is incredible. So these are all different wine grapes. Look at the size, look at the color, look at the immense variety that you find there. And so the amount of diversity that we see here, the amount of potential in terms of bioactives and food content, it's really very, very amazing. Probably one of the most diverse crops that we know of. So one of the things that distinguishes wine grapes, though, from regular grapes is that they are smaller, they're sweeter, and the seeds. And the seeds are a really interesting thing. So if you look at other berries, grapes are a berry. If you look at other berries, think about raspberries or cranberries or strawberries. The seeds in relationship to the fruit are actually very, very small. The mass of those seeds isn't that significant when you compare it with the mass of the berry. But when you look at a wine grape, those seeds are actually really large as a percentage and as a ratio to what's in there. It actually comprises a fair amount of the mass that's there. That's one of the keys to what we're doing, actually. We're going to talk about that a little bit more, but that seed mass is very important. The other thing that's really important to realize is that in a wine grape, that skin to pulp ratio is also very high, right? So you've got a lot more color, you've got a lot more flavor and aroma and everything else in a wine grape than you would have in a regular grape or many other fruits, because there's so much more skin in relationship to pulp. And that means you have a lot more flavor. And when you think about it, it makes sense. Because a wine grape is designed to be fermented, which means in the product that you get from wine grapes, there's no sugar. It's all been fermented out. So if you want it to taste good and you want it to be interesting and you want it to be high value, you have to make sure that if you're a farmer and you're breeding it or you've got a vineyard, over time you're selecting the best grapes. And so, over the last 8,000 years, these things have been carefully selected and cultivated to taste good even if there's no sugar present. And that's really interesting, because the same things that make it taste good and that make it colorful are the same things that make it healthy. So that's why it's a superfood. It's a superfood because humans have been, not consciously, but they've been selecting it for those very properties over time because they've been looking for something that has really interesting taste and color profiles, even without a lot of sugar in it. So that leads us to the second question that I usually get from people when I tell them that we're making chocolate with Chardonnay in it. The first question is, do you have any of that chocolate on you? The second question is, why Chardonnay? You've got all these wine grapes out there that you could work with. Why did you pick Chardonnay to work with? Well, the simple answer is it's actually surprisingly healthy. So when Sonoma Pharmaceuticals was founded back in 2009, actually, it's been a long journey, there were 8 different products that Sonoma Pharmaceuticals was looking at, 8 different grapes, actually. So they were working with Cabernet Sauvignon, Chardonnay, Merlot, Syrah, Sauvignon Blanc, Pinot Noir, Zinfandel, and Riesling. These were all of the materials that we were capturing out of a wine press, turning into powders. And at the time, actually, we were separating seeds and skins. We were making oil from the seeds. So we had 24 different raw materials that we were working with at that time. Pretty amazing endeavor, actually. In the course of doing that work, though, we started to do a little bit of investigation into some of the health benefits. And what we found was, to everyone's surprise, this work was done for us largely at USDA, that Chardonnay was the one that kept coming up as being the best. In comparison with Cab, in comparison with Merlot, and even the Reds, we found that Chardonnay had more profound health effects than the others, starting with a blood glucose analysis, then moving on to plasma insulin effects. From there, we looked at plasma lipoprotein. So basically, we're talking about cholesterol and the amount of HDL, VDL, and LDL in a product, in blood. And then we thought, well, maybe the chemistry is what's driving it. So we started looking at the polyphenols, and we compared it with other whites because they weren't performing as well, and found out that actually Chardonnay does have higher levels of polyphenols, catechins, and epicatechins, epigallocatechin than these other varieties do. So this was surprising, actually. People were assuming, number one, that reds were going to be better for you than whites. It didn't turn out to be true in the testing that USDA did. And secondly, that, Chardonnay itself was thought of as just being kind of a really delicious wine, but not necessarily a heavyweight when it came to bioactivity. Not true. And after looking at these polyphenols, with some encouragement from Harold and others at UC Davis, we started to look into the oligosaccharides, which you're going to hear a lot more about that today. So we looked at the oligosaccharides and thought, well, what kind of potential do these oligosaccharides have for actually helping in modulation of the microbiome? And to our surprise, we found that not only was there good potential for actually feeding the bacteria that we think of as friendly bacteria, but what this slide shows here is that it suppresses the growth of the undesirable bacteria, which is a really cool thing, right? So you grow the good ones and you suppress the bad ones. That's a really interesting idea. So because of that, we decided to deploy some AI. We started looking into all of the things that these known bioactives in Chardonnay could be useful for, and found a huge potential area in many different areas of human health. So not only in what is normally thought of as being the area that red wine and resveratrol and other things are good for, which is mainly cardiometabolic health, but we started seeing other kinds of things there too, things related to inflammation, things related to the urogenital tract, all kinds of interesting applications that could come out of it. So what we had to do really is we had to look at that and say, well, we have an embarrassment of riches here. Where do we focus, right? So we've decided to focus largely on gut health. That's one of the things that came to the surface again and again and again. And so again, we did some analysis using AI, and what we found was the predicted effects of Chardonnay constituents on gut health are actually very profound. So we saw some novel effects, which you see there in the yellow section of the ring, and then you see others which are not really well understood, but then you see some positive and predicted associations that are very significant for all of these, both with the phenolics and also with the oligosaccharides. And that's what makes it really interesting, is this combination of both in one food. So when you look at why natural products are interesting, and Harold talked about this a little bit, one of the things that I think is a little hard for people to understand and get their head around is that natural products have this way of working. The term for it is called pleiotropic, which basically means that there's a multitude of mechanisms that natural products work on simultaneously. So with a drug, what they usually do is they try and isolate one enzyme or one protein or one particular pathway, and they just hit that really hard. And it has profound effects that happen very quickly. It also has a lot of side effects because of that. But what natural products do instead is they work with a lot of these natural systems in many different ways, some of them subtle, but nonetheless, they're complementary. And the reason it works that way is because of evolution and evolutionary biology, where these foods have evolved with people, and they work in concert with our natural systems. So we see a whole host of effects that happen all at once as a result of many different constituents in natural products. And in many cases, there's a unifying theme. In this case, it's blood sugar. But we see these kind of effects over and over again in natural products, and Chardonnay is a terrific example of how that works. And it explains why we see so many interesting effects. So a couple of just quick things also to help you understand where some of the differences in red versus white come from, right? One of the things that a lot of people don't know is that red wines are made from fermented grapes. So you take the grapes, you ferment them for a while, it's called maceration, and then that's what you press. That fermented mass is what goes into the wine press, and what comes out of it is further fermented, but there's already some fermentation that takes place. White wines are actually made from fresh fruit. You don't ferment the fruit first. You take the fruit, you put it into the wine press, and you ferment only the juice. So why is that relevant to what we're doing? Well, what it means is that the Chardonnay Marc that's in bind-to-bark chocolate is essentially fresh powdered fruit, right? No fermentation, no transformation. We take all that goodness, everything that's in there, and that's what comes back out for us. The other thing that's interesting about white grapes is that they have a slightly shorter growing season, which means that they actually develop less sugar. Red grapes generally have more sugar than white grapes do, which is also something that I think people don't realize. So they have a little more acid, they have more tannins, they have more phenolic acids and more flavonols. Where what we see in red grapes is more sugar, less acid. However, it has more anthocyanins, which is where you get those nice colors from, and more of the stilbenes, of which resveratrol is one. So you see a lot of these more complicated products that come from that development of color and other things. So that's how the chemistry in them differs. So the second surprise that we had was regarding sustainability. Now, why is it surprising? I mean, we're talking about an upcycled product, right? We're taking a waste product and we're turning it into something useful. What's really surprising about it is, like I said before, when we first started doing this, Sonomaceuticals had seeds, they had flowers, and they had oils. And that's kind of the traditional way that not just grape products have been treated, but most upcycled products have been treated. Let's break it down, that byproduct that comes out of the manufacturing, and make it into something else. So we're going to take it apart and we're going to do other things with it. Maybe we'll isolate the protein out of it. Maybe we'll isolate some fiber out of it. But it was this kind of deconstruction of that material that everyone went through, and we went through that too. What was surprising is that when everything was all said and done, when the science was done, when we had gone through our manufacturing process, when we looked at what was the best tasting product and everything else, what we discovered is that everything that comes out of the wine press is the best product. What we do is we simply try to preserve that in the best possible way. So all we do when we get that marc that comes out of the press is we remove any foreign material that might be left in there. We get rid of some of the stems. We get rid of any little foreign matter that might have made its way in there. And then we use 100% of the rest. And that was a surprise. So we don't create another waste stream. We don't have to do a lot of further processing to our material. We actually use everything. And that is pretty unique, actually. If you look at the world of upcycling, almost everything else creates either another waste stream, or it takes a lot more processing and everything else to make it, and you're left with something else, then is a waste product of the upcycling. We don't do that. So this is one of the most sustainable products you're going to find. The other thing about sustainability that I think is really important is kind of what Harold was saying initially, which is compliance is key, right? So if you want people to use an upcycled product, if it's truly sustainable, it has to be a product that people want, that's desirable, and that actually consumers will respond to very positively. Vine to Bar, which is our first actually designed for consumer product, we've got better than 95% 5-star reviews on it. So we know people like it. We know they're going to keep using it over and over and over again. It also has to have outstanding nutritional value. It doesn't make any sense to try and use upcycled products instead of other products if those products aren't better for you and don't have actually better attributes to it. Then there's authenticity. Instead of greenwashing, which is, where people will add just a little pinch of something that's upcycled, kind of like they used to do with recycled plastics in packaging. I remember when the first few bottles came out that said it contains recycled content. Well, that recycled content in those plastic bottles was like 2 or 3%. It really wasn't meaningful at all. We actually have 15% by weight Chardonnay Marc in our chocolate. That's a huge amount. It's a very significant percentage. And then lastly, like I said, we don't create additional problems or waste because we use 100% of what we get. The other thing that was kind of surprising to us is that it's surprisingly tasty. Now, this isn't quite as surprising as the others because Chardonnay is pretty tasty. But what was interesting about it and what was surprising about it is that it makes other foods taste better. It wasn't just that the Chardonnay Marc itself tasted good. It was its ability to enhance the taste of other foods. So the first one we worked with, of course, was chocolate. And when we first started working with it, I honestly thought that what we were going to have to do is we were going to have to say to people, hey, look, this stuff's better for you than regular chocolate is, right? It's got more fiber in it. It's got lots more flavonols. It has all these things you want. So it may not be quite as good as regular chocolate, but that's okay because this is going to be better for you. That would be the message that we'd have to put out there. I couldn't have been more wrong. It's better than dark chocolates. We have a 65% chocolate, a 65% dark that actually eats more like a 50% because Chardonnay mitigates that bitterness. Those extra fruit acids and aldehydes that are in there, they give it a subtle character to it that actually makes it taste much better and sweeter, even without the addition of sugar, than regular chocolate does, because it covers up some of those things that make it so that you can't taste the sweetness that's in there. In fact, that observation and that property was so surprising that we've been granted a U.S. patent. We just received notice of allowance here a couple of months ago, and so we'll be adding that patent number to our chocolate bars. So, when I look at what WellVine is and what we've managed to do here, the surprise is that we're in a space where it's very difficult to get to. So on the left here, what you see is what they normally call the, kind of the innovation triad, right? You can be any of these two, but you can't be all three. You can be fast and good, you can be fast and cheap, or you can be good and cheap. But it's really hard to get to all three. In fact, I don't know if you can see it right there, but that's a little tiny picture of a unicorn in the middle. So that is very difficult to achieve. I'm not saying we got there necessarily. It took us quite a while and quite a bit of money to innovate. So we didn't break the mold when it came to the innovation triad. But when you look over here at what I would call the perfect trifecta or the triad of food and food innovation, it's hard to be tasty, healthy, and sustainable all at the same time. Those three are very difficult to accomplish. Usually, if you're tasty and healthy, you're not sustainable, or if you're tasty and sustainable, it's not very good for you, or if you're healthy and sustainable, it's not very tasty. But we actually have managed to get all three. So when it comes to food innovation, WellVine is actually something of a unicorn. So what's next? Well, first of all, I think WellVine is what I would term a smart prebiotic. So what do I mean by a smart prebiotic? It encourages friendly bacteria while discouraging the growth of undesirable species. That's a really interesting idea. A lot of prebiotics, it's true that they do actually encourage the growth of lactobacillus or bifidobacteria or other things that you want, but they also have a property called cross-feeding, where they can feed bacteria that you don't want them to actually feed. But because of both the composition of our oligosaccharides and the inclusion of phenolics, we see a more discriminating prebiotic, right? One that discriminates between the good ones and the unfriendly ones. And that's due to the highly diverse composition of fiber and flavonols. We also have a product that's a whole fruit. We're talking about a whole fruit matrix. It's simply been dejuiced. So what does that mean? All the goodness of fruit, but with 70% or so less sugar. And it improves the taste of high phenolic extracts in foods. So other things that are high in those phenolics, flavonoids that you want, they're going to taste better when you combine it. So what kind of applications? Obviously applications in supplements, all kinds of different pills and such. We're also going to be coming out with our own product that will combine the WellVine raw material with cacao. That'll be the first thing that we launch here before long, and other interesting bioactive materials. And then, of course, we think that there'll be a lot of really interesting food applications too, right? Because it makes things taste better, increases the amount of fiber that you have, etc. One of the things that I want you to pay attention to later today when we have lunch is that every item on the menu for your lunch today will have WellVine in it in some way. So that's the level of flexibility and diversity that we think we have in this material. And that's it. So thank you for your time and for your attendance.